Imagine this. It's 2027. The Eurozone has shattered. ATMs in Milan have stopped working. Berlin's trains are frozen. French farmers block the highways, furious over border checks that were supposed to be gone forever.
A BBC anchor stares into the camera. Tonight, the European Union is no more.
Could this really happen? Or is it just another crisis in a long line of them? In this video, we explore the warning signs that Europe is sleepwalking toward collapse, from ballooning debt and political gridlock to aging populations, energy chaos, and a resurgent wave of nationalism. This isn't speculation, it's already unfolding, and that's the system we're decoding today. For over 70 years, it has stood as the world's most ambitious political and economic experiment. A continent of ancient rivalries reborn from the ashes of total war, striving for a future of shared prosperity and perpetual peace. The European Union, a project of immense scale and breathtaking idealism. But what happens when the foundations of that grand project, laid down in an era of optimism, begin to show their age? What happens when the very forces that were meant to bind it together start to pull it apart? The dream of a united Europe is facing its greatest test, and the question is no longer if it can survive, but for how much longer. So, how did this all begin? To understand the fragility of the present, we must return to the promise of the past. Let's rewind to the 1990s. The Cold War had ended. The Berlin Wall, that stark symbol of division, was rubble. A wave of euphoria swept the continent. The dream of a united Europe, a dream that had haunted thinkers for centuries, finally seemed within reach. This wasn't just about preventing another war, it was about creating a new kind of power. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 was the blueprint. Borders would vanish, trade would flow freely, and most audaciously, a single currency, the euro, would be minted, designed to bind the economies of vastly different nations into a single formidable bloc. People spoke of a United States of Europe. But from day one, the EU was a house built on a series of profound compromises. It was a monetary union without a true fiscal union. This meant economically diverse countries, from the industrial powerhouse of Germany to the tourism-dependent economy of Greece, were locked into one currency and one interest rate, set by the European Central Bank. They shared a roof, but each nation was still responsible for its own plumbing and wiring. Politically distant nations were expected to align. The result? A system that worked beautifully in the sunshine of economic growth, but was dangerously unprepared for a storm. The stress would inevitably expose the cracks. That storm arrived in 2008. The global financial crisis, born in the US housing market, slammed into Europe with brutal force. And the first domino to wobble was Greece. Its economy, burdened by debt and structural inefficiencies, collapsed. Unable to devalue its own currency to regain competitiveness, a tool it had given up to join the euro, it faced bankruptcy. Germany and other northern creditors, fearing a catastrophic contagion, demanded severe austerity in exchange for bailouts. In Athens, the response was fury. Greeks protested in the streets against what they saw as a punitive ultimatum. Bailouts flowed, riots followed, the euro survived barely, but the cost was immense. Trust, the invisible glue of the entire project, had been corroded. Now, zoom out. The Greek crisis was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper continental divide. Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, all struggled under similar pressures of high debt and low growth. A narrative took hold, pitting the frugal and responsible North against the profligate and irresponsible South. Northern nations like the Netherlands and Finland grumbled about their taxpayers funding bailouts. Southern nations resented the economic medicine being forced upon them. The cultural and economic fault lines, papered over during the good times, were now chasms, and those lines never really healed. They festered, fueling a new wave of political discontent. By the time Britain, a nation historically skeptical of deep European integration, voted to leave the EU in 2016, the warnings were flashing red. Brexit was a political earthquake. It sent shockwaves not just through the financial markets, but through the very idea of a shared European identity. The message was undeniable. Not everyone felt at home in the house that Brussels was building. For the first time, the project was not just stalling. It was going into reverse. EU leaders scrambled to project an image of unity and restore faith. More summits were held. New treaties were proposed. New budgets were allocated. The European Central Bank was given more power to police the financial system. But these were patches, not solutions. They were technical fixes for what had become a deeply emotional and political problem. They never truly addressed the underlying fractures, the different languages, the competing histories, the divergent economies, and the conflicting national ambitions, all stitched together with treaties and directives, but never fully fused into a single coherent whole. Imagine trying to build a single modern skyscraper using bricks and materials scavenged from a dozen different historical buildings. Some bricks are Roman, some are Gothic, some are brand new. For a while, it might stand. But apply enough weight, enough external pressure, and it's no surprise when the entire structure starts to buckle. Fast forward to the present day. The economic landscape of Europe is a far cry from the optimism of its founding years. The continent is now caught in a precarious financial position, a debt trap that has been decades in the making, but has been dangerously accelerated by recent crises. Europe's debt problem isn't a recent phenomenon, but the scale and complexity of it are now worse than ever before. The foundations are trembling under the weight of obligations that may be impossible to repay. Consider the sheer numbers. Italy, the Eurozone's third largest economy, owes a staggering sum equivalent to more than 135% of its entire annual economic output. France, the second largest, is not far behind, hovering around 110%. Even Germany, long celebrated as the continent's paragon of fiscal discipline, has seen its own debt levels surge. The necessity of funding massive energy subsidies in the wake of the Ukraine war, coupled with increased defense spending, has forced Berlin to abandon its once sacred balanced budget rules. The total government debt in the euro area now exceeds 12 trillion euros. It's a figure so vast it loses meaning. A mountain of IOUs casting a long shadow over the continent's future. To understand how perilous this is, let's compare it to post-war Europe. Back in the 1950s and 60s, countries were literally rebuilding from rubble. But they had powerful tailwinds. They possessed a crucial demographic advantage: young, growing populations fueling booming industries. This was the era of the Trente Glorieuses, 30 glorious years of unprecedented economic expansion, further lubricated by US financial support through the Marshall Plan. Today, the picture is inverted. Europe is defined by aging societies with shrinking workforces, sluggish, near-zero growth, and a deeply fragmented global economy where it faces fierce competition from both the United States and China. The engines of post-war growth have stalled. So, what happens when the next inevitable shock hits? A new pandemic? A geopolitical flare-up? Another energy crisis? The primary line of defense, the European Central Bank, finds itself in an impossible position. It has no easy answers, only a series of painful trade-offs. If it raises interest rates aggressively to combat inflation, it risks making the colossal debt burdens of countries like Italy and Spain completely unsustainable, potentially triggering a default. But if it keeps rates low or prints more money to ease the debt burden, it risks letting inflation run rampant, eroding savings and destabilizing the entire economy. This tightrope is already wobbling. The ECB has been forced to invent ever more complex tools, like the Transmission Protection Instrument, designed to prevent the bond markets of weaker countries from spiraling out of control. But these are just temporary fixes, financial sedatives for a deeply sick patient. The markets are watching every move, every statement, every piece of data, searching for signs of weakness. And here's where the true systemic danger lies: the domino risk. If one major economy, like Italy or Spain, can no longer afford to pay its debts, confidence evaporates in an instant. Investors, fearing they won't get their money back, would dump that country's bonds, causing their value to plummet. Banks across Europe, which hold trillions of euros of this government debt on their balance sheets, would face catastrophic losses and begin to panic. Credit markets would freeze, currencies would plunge. This isn't a theoretical exercise, it's recent history. Remember the 2011 Eurozone debt crisis? It started in a small economy, Greece, and nearly brought down the entire global financial system. A similar crisis today, starting in a much larger economy, would be an order of magnitude more devastating. The European Union was built on a promise of consensus, an ideal of an ever closer union forged from the ashes of war. For decades, this principle of shared decision-making was the engine of integration, the very bedrock of the project. But beneath the surface of institutional procedure, a political earthquake has been gathering force for over a decade. The consensus is not just breaking, it is being systematically dismantled from within. Enter the politics. The grand consensus is fracturing under the weight of a powerful nationalist resurgence. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally has successfully shed its fringe label to become a dominant force in mainstream politics, a credible contender for the presidency. In Italy, Giorgia May Elziolonis, Brothers of Italy, a party with post-fascist roots, rose from obscurity to lead the government, a seismic shift for a founding EU member. In Hungary, Viktor Orban openly mocks Brussels, framing his leadership as a defense of national sovereignty against an overbearing empire. And for years, Poland's former nationalist regime systematically ignored EU court rulings, challenging the very supremacy of European law. These are not isolated events. They are the visible crests of a populist wave that has been building since the 2008 financial crisis and the 2015 migration crisis. Why is this happening? Because vast segments of the European citizenry feel left behind, their concerns ignored by a distant elite. In rural France, struggling farmers argue that complex EU environmental regulations and trade deals hurt their livelihoods more than they help. In southern Italy, where youth unemployment stubbornly sits above 30%, the promise of European prosperity feels like a cruel joke. In Germany, a housing crisis is exacerbated by population pressures, and immigrants become an easy scapegoat for rising costs and strained public services. Each grievance, whether economic, cultural, or social, becomes potent fuel for nationalist anger. And here is the crucial distinction. These parties are no longer just shouting from the sidelines. They aren't just criticizing the EU. They're winning elections. They are translating popular discontent into real political power at the national level. The result is a creeping paralysis within the EU's core institutions. More national vetoes on foreign policy, more walkouts during critical budget negotiations, less unity on everything from climate change to defense. The machinery of Brussels, designed for cooperation, is grinding to a halt. Even among traditional allies, the old bonds are fraying. The Franco-German engine, once the driving force of European integration, now sputters and stalls as Paris and Berlin squabble over defense strategy, industrial subsidies, and fiscal rules. A deep chasm has opened between Eastern and Western Europe over migration policy and the rule of law. Meanwhile, the historic divide between the fiscally conservative North and the debt-laden South continues to poison debates on economic governance and burden sharing. The upcoming European Parliament elections are no longer a sleepy, low-turnout affair. They are a critical battleground that could fundamentally tilt the entire balance of power. What if a coalition of nationalist and Eurosceptic forces gains a blocking minority or even a majority? What happens to climate legislation, to the budget, to foreign policy, when key decisions can no longer be passed? The very legislative capacity of the Union is at stake. The ultimate danger is not a dramatic sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing decay. A death by 1,000 cuts, where the Union becomes ungovernable, irrelevant, and incapable of acting. What happens when the system breaks not because of a formidable enemy at the gates, but because of the democratic choices made from within? Let's talk numbers. Europe is shrinking. Fewer babies, more retirees, entire regions are emptying out. In Italy and Spain, entire villages are being abandoned. In Germany, some towns have more people over 80 than under 10. By 2100, Europe's share of the global population will be less than 5%. This has consequences. Fewer workers means fewer taxes. More retirees means higher spending. Healthcare systems will be strained. Pensions could vanish. Let's do some math. In 1970, there were roughly 4 workers per retiree. By 2040, that ratio could be 2 to 1 or worse. This puts pressure on immigration, but that opens another divide. While economies need migrants, politics reject them. It's a loop with no easy exit. You've got Germany and Sweden saying, yes, we need more people. Then you have Hungary and Poland saying, not like this. The result? Deadlock. And when societies age and feel unsafe, guess who wins? Populists, nationalists, fear-based politics. The EU, built on cooperation, now struggles to agree on who should even live inside its borders. Russia's war in Ukraine didn't just redraw borders, it blew up assumptions. Europe thought peace was permanent, that gas would always flow, that trade with China could stay neutral. Now, winter energy bills have tripled in some regions. Germany rushed to restart coal plants. France leans heavily on nuclear. Meanwhile, sanctions against Russia boomeranged back, hitting European industries. Military spending is up, borders are more tense. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. What does that say about trust in EU defense? There is no European army, just promises. And in times of war, promises aren't enough. In fact, if the US pulls back from NATO, will the EU be ready? Most analysts say no. If another crisis breaks, say in the Balkans or the Baltics, will the EU act together? History suggests maybe not. Let's play out the nightmare. The year is 2030. Italy exits the euro after a populist referendum. Spain considers following. The euro plunges in value. Germany pulls out emergency controls. Border checks return. French farmers dump produce at crossings. Truck lines stretch for kilometers. Youth across the continent riot, demanding opportunities that no longer exist. English is still spoken, but cooperation is gone. Old rivalries return. Tourism crashes. Supply chains snap. New currencies bring confusion. Banks limit withdrawals. Supermarkets run out of imports. Global markets panic. NATO is tested. The US watches nervously. Chaos, not cooperation, becomes Europe's new normal. Sound dramatic? Maybe. But every piece of this puzzle already exists. Collapse doesn't come with a bang. It creeps. The European Union is a grand idea. Peace, prosperity, partnership. But ideas need glue, political will, shared identity, trust. Right now, those are cracking. So what holds it together? Maybe shared threats. Maybe a new generation. Maybe reform that actually listens to frustrated citizens. Or maybe nothing does. And that brings us back to the opening scene. The headlines, the frozen ATMs, the empty square. Will it happen? No one knows. But ignoring the warning signs, that's the real danger. So, what do you think? Will the EU survive this storm, or is it already too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to understand how these global forces impact your own finances, your job, your future, check out our earlier video. Why isn't your net worth growing? It could be this asset, because the collapse of a union isn't just politics, it's personal.